The suitcase was not large. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed if anyone had been paying attention. It was a modest navy blue suitcase with a broken wheel that dragged slightly on the marble floor, making a quiet, rhythmic scraping sound as Adaeze Blackwell pulled it down the hallway of her own home. Her steps were measured. Her face was composed. Her eyes were dry. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were something you gave to people who deserved them. The hallway was long. 22 feet of polished white marble, bordered by dark mahogany wall panels, and lit by a chandelier that Marcus had ordered from a French glassmaker at a cost of $60,000. Adaeze had been there the day it was installed. She had stood in the same hallway and watched it catch the afternoon light, and she had thought it was beautiful. That was 4 years ago. Tonight, walking beneath it with her suitcase, she felt nothing about it at all. At the far end of the hallway, the master bedroom door was closed. Behind her, at the top of the staircase, Marcus stood with his arms folded. He was still dressed in his dinner clothes, a charcoal blazer, an open-collared white shirt, the cufflinks she had bought him for their second anniversary still on his wrists. He watched her walk. He did not move. His expression held the particular quality of a man who had convinced himself that he was being reasonable. "The guest room is fully furnished," he said. His voice carried down the hallway with clean, hollow precision. "I had Rosa change the linens this morning." Adaeze did not turn around. She continued walking. The broken wheel scraped. The chandelier glowed. The house was silent except for those two sounds, her suitcase against the marble and the faint hum of the climate system that kept the entire property at a steady 71 degrees year-round. "Ada!" She stopped, not because the word moved her, but because she chose to stop. She turned slowly and looked at him. He was standing at the top of the staircase, one hand resting on the banister, looking down at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to be inconvenient. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, classically handsome the way that old money tends to produce, jaw sharp, posture straight, eyes carrying the permanent expression of a man who had never once in his life been told that he was wrong. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he said. "It's just a sleeping arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment, just looked at him, the kind of look that contains an entire conversation that the other person does not yet know how to read. Then she turned back around and continued walking. The guest room was at the end of the east wing. She opened the door, stepped inside, and quietly closed it behind her. She set the small suitcase down beside the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress. Rosa had indeed changed the linens white cotton, pressed and clean, and she placed both hands flat on her thighs and sat very still for a moment. The room was comfortable. It was tastefully decorated. It had a private bathroom, a bay window that overlooked the east garden, and a reading chair in a corner that had never been used by anyone. It was not her room. She knew exactly what this was. She had known since the moment Marcus had spoken the words that afternoon, his voice casual, almost bored, as though he were rearranging furniture rather than dismantling a marriage. She had sat across from him at the kitchen table and heard every single word, and she had nodded once, a slow, deliberate nod, and said nothing, because Adaeze Okonkwo Blackwell had learned something over the course of her 38 years on this earth, something that most people spent their entire lives never quite grasping. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who already knows everything, and has decided to say nothing yet. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and removed a single folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, smoothed it against her thigh, and read the numbers printed on it one more time. 42,300,000,000 and some change. She folded the paper. She placed it back in her pocket. She looked at the white ceiling. And then, for the first time all evening, Adaeze Blackwell allowed herself the smallest, quietest, most private smile. To understand what happened in that house, you must first understand who Adaeze was, and more importantly, who Marcus Blackwell had decided she was, which was an entirely different thing. She was born in Lagos, Nigeria, the only daughter of Dr. Emmanuel Okonkwo and his wife, Ngozi. Her father had been a quiet, methodical man, a civil engineer by training who had, over the course of 30 years, quietly built one of the most significant infrastructure and hospitality conglomerates on the African continent. He was not the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers. He did not give interviews. He drove a modest car and wore the same brand of dress shoes for decades. He was, in almost every external sense, invisible. This was entirely deliberate. Emmanuel Okonkwo believed, with deep philosophical conviction, that visible wealth was a distraction, that the truly powerful were those whose influence moved through the world quietly, like deep water rather than white rapids. He raised his daughter on this belief. He taught her accounting before she could drive. He walked her through quarterly reports over dinner when she was 13. By the time she was 17, she could read a balance sheet the way other teenagers read novels, with ease, with instinct, with genuine pleasure. When Emmanuel Okonkwo died, 6 months after Adeze's 29th birthday, he left behind no dramatical reading, no contested inheritance, no family war. He left behind a single envelope, addressed in his careful handwriting to his daughter. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, and a summary document prepared by his legal team. The summary outlined the full scope of his holdings. Hotels across 12 African nations. A logistics network that moved goods through 6 countries. Commercial real estate portfolios in Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, and Johannesburg. Investment holdings across 3 continents. A private equity arm that had quietly accumulated stakes in 47 companies worldwide. The total figure at the time of his passing was $38 billion. In the years since, under Adeze's patient invisible management, it had grown. She did not advertise this. She had never advertised this. In Lagos business circles, certain people knew the Okonkwo name with deep reverence, but even they did not fully grasp the scale, because the scale had been deliberately structured to resist full view. There were 17 different holding entities across 8 jurisdictions, each connected to the others through a web that her father's lawyers had spent decades constructing with the care of master architects. You could stare directly at it and see nothing. That was the point. She had met Marcus Blackwell at an international business conference in London 4.5 years ago. He was the CEO of Blackwell Capital Management, a respectable mid-tier private equity firm managing approximately $900 million in assets. By any ordinary standard, he was successful. He was intelligent, polished, and had the particular magnetism of a man accustomed to being the most important person in most rooms he entered. He had no idea what he was standing next to. She had been introduced simply as Ada Okonkwo. No titles, no context. She had been wearing a plain navy dress, no visible jewelry, comfortable shoes. He had charmed her across the dinner table with talk of African market opportunities, which she found privately amusing, and she had responded warmly and said little of substance, which she had always been very good at. He had pursued her with the confidence of a man who considered himself the more impressive party in the courtship. She had allowed it, not out of weakness, but because she recognized something in him, a kind of restless energy, a genuine passion beneath the arrogance, and because she was 34 years old and tired of rooms where no one surprised her. Marcus Blackwell, for a brief and genuine season, had surprised her. They married in a small ceremony in London. Adaeze had insisted on small. Marcus had assumed this was because her family was modest. He had never been to Lagos to see what modesty looked like when it chose to wear itself. His mother, Eleanor Blackwell, had smiled tightly at the wedding and said all the right things and held Adeze's hand for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary. In those 3 seconds, Adaeze had read everything she needed to know about the years that lay ahead. They settled in Marcus's property, a grand Georgian townhouse in Kensington, London, and a sprawling modern estate in Connecticut countryside, which was where they spent most of their time. The Connecticut estate was by any standard an extraordinary home. 7 bedrooms, a wine cellar, a pool house, staff who arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays, grounds that stretched for 6 acres behind a gated stone wall. Marcus was proud of this house. He referred to it often as the family estate. He spoke of its value with the casual authority of a man who had worked hard for something. It was worth, at current market rates, approximately $14 million. Adaeze had once, in a moment of quiet arithmetic, calculated that the revenue from a single mid-tier property in her Lagos portfolio generated more monthly income than the entire assessed value of this Connecticut estate. She had kept this calculation to herself, because this was who Adaeze Blackwell was, a woman who understood that knowledge held quietly was more powerful than knowledge announced. She had built her life on this principle. She had managed an empire on this principle. And she had, until the night she carried her suitcase down the hallway, extended the benefit of that principle to her marriage. The disrespect had not arrived all at once. It never does in houses like that one. It arrives in pieces, small enough that each piece can be dismissed, explained, absorbed. It accumulates the way water accumulates in a closed room, slowly, quietly, until one morning you realize you are standing in it up to your knees and have been for quite some time. It began with Eleanor. Marcus's mother visited 4 or 5 times a year, always arriving with the energy of someone who considered their visits a gift rather than an imposition. She was 70 years old, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, and possessed of a particular cruelty that can only be sustained by a lifetime of social approval. She never said anything overtly unkind to Adaeze. That was not her style. Eleanor Blackwell operated entirely in the register of implication. "Ada, darling, you've been so quiet tonight. Are you following a conversation?" she had said once, at a dinner party, in front of 12 guests, her voice warm and her eyes absolutely cold. Adaeze had looked at her and smiled. "I always follow the conversation, Eleanor." And she had returned to her wine and said nothing further. But she had heard, and she had noted. Eleanor had a habit of referring to the Connecticut estate as Marcus's house. Never their house, never the Blackwell home, always Marcus's. She would compliment the decor choices Adaeze had made, the bookshelves she had curated, the dining table she had sourced from craftsmen in Nairobi, and then carefully attribute them to Marcus. "You have such good taste, darling," she would say to her son, in front of his wife, about object his wife had chosen. Marcus accepted these compliments without correction. Adaeze noted this too. Then there was the matter of the business. Marcus had begun, in the 2nd year of their marriage, to lean on Adaeze's quiet financial instincts during his firm's more complex investment decisions. He had noticed, early on, that she had a remarkable eye for risk, that she could look at a deal structure and locate its weakest point in the time it took him to finish his coffee. He had initially been charmed by this. He had told his colleagues she was sharp. He had called her his secret weapon at home, with a warmth that felt genuine. By the 3rd year, the framing had shifted. He began to present her insights to his partners as his own, not dramatically, just seamlessly, the way a man smoothly incorporates something into his worldview without consciously registering that it did not originate there. She would analyze a deal over breakfast, and by afternoon, he would be delivering her conclusions in a board meeting without attribution. She said nothing. She watched. His junior partners, who visited the house occasionally for informal weekend strategy sessions, had developed the habit of speaking past her at the dining table, directing their questions and comments exclusively to Marcus, as though she were a beautifully dressed piece of furniture that had been placed there for aesthetic purposes. One of them, a young man named Derek who wore expensive watches and spoke with the volume of someone who confused confidence with noise, had once interrupted her mid-sentence to address a point to Marcus. Marcus had let the interruption stand. She had excused herself from the table quietly, gone to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the window over the sink for exactly 2 minutes. Then she had walked back to the table, sat down, and resumed the conversation as though nothing had occurred, because for her purposes, nothing significant had. Not yet. The summer of their 3rd anniversary had brought a particular moment that Adaeze would later identify, and acquire her own memory, as the first time she felt the floor shift beneath the marriage. Marcus's firm had been pursuing a major acquisition, a portfolio of commercial properties in the southeastern United States, a deal worth approximately $300 million. The financing had stalled. His lead investor had gone cold. 2 weeks of calls and meetings had produced nothing. Marcus had been tense, short-tempered, sleeping badly. One evening, over dinner, she had said quietly, "The problem is the debt structure. The senior tranche is too exposed on the front end. If you restructure the mezz layer and approach the institutional tranche separately with a longer lockup commitment, the lead investor comes back. They don't want less risk. They want a different shape of risk." He had looked at her across the table, set down his fork, and said, with genuine surprise, the surprise of someone discovering unexpectedly, that the painting on their wall is actually a window. How do you know that? She had smiled and said, I read. He had followed the restructuring approach. The deal closed 3 weeks later, significantly above initial projections. His partners toasted him at a celebratory dinner. She had sat beside him at that dinner, while men congratulated him on his brilliant instinct and sharp financial thinking. He had not corrected them. She had raised her glass and smiled. But the shift she had felt that evening was not about credit or recognition. It was something more subtle and in some ways more unsettling. Because in Marcus's eyes, after that moment, she had become something. And then, almost immediately, she had watched him decide what to do with that something. And what he decided, gradually, incrementally, over the month that followed, was that her quiet intelligence was something he should contain, manage, keep close and small. A woman who was too capable was, in the architecture of Marcus Blackwell's ego, structurally inconvenient. And so the reframing began. Her opinions were heard and then redirected. Her presence at business-related social functions was managed. She would be introduced as my wife, Ada, with a warmth that was also a boundary, a warmth that said, she is here because I brought her, not because she belongs. When she offered commentary in group settings, he would place a hand gently on her arm, not an affectionate gesture, but a closing one, the conversational equivalent of a door being softly shut. She read all of it, every gesture, every silence, every careful small erasure. And she continued, with extraordinary composure, to say nothing, because Adaeze Okonkwo Blackwell was not waiting for the right moment to react. She was waiting for the right moment to act. The dinner party was Eleanor's idea. It was held at the Connecticut estate on a Saturday evening in late autumn. 40 guests, catered by a firm from Manhattan that charged accordingly. The occasion was nominally a celebration of Marcus's firm reaching $1 billion in assets under management, a milestone that had arrived, though no one in that room would ever know it, precisely because of 2 investment decisions that Adaeze had quietly guided him toward over the preceding 18 months. She had spent the afternoon helping Rosa arrange the flowers and the seating. She had worn a deep green silk dress and her mother's pearl earrings and done her own hair the way she had learned as a girl in Lagos, careful and deliberate and beautiful. She had looked at herself in the mirror before descending the stairs and recognized the woman she saw there with calm, clear eyes. The guests began arriving at 7. By 8, the rooms were full and warm and the conversation had a particular hum of comfortable wealth. Easy and assured, the sound of people who had never had be loud to be heard. Adaeze moved through it gracefully, welcoming people, holding conversations with the natural ease of someone for whom social fluency was not performance but a mother tongue. Eleanor arrived at 7:30. She had brought with her a woman named Cassandra Holt, 50-ish blonde, recently divorced from a hedge fund manager, wearing the particular expression of someone who has decided to be interesting. Eleanor introduced her to Marcus first, then to Adaeze, and in the geography of that introduction, Marcus before the wife, in the wife's own home, was a small statement that Eleanor delivered with a smile. It was at the dinner table at approximately 9:30 that it happened. The conversation had turned to the commercial real estate market in the Southeast. Someone had raised it in connection with Marcus's firm, and the table had engaged with the comfortable authority of people who consider themselves informed. Adaeze had been quiet for most of it, listening, as was her habit. Then a senior investor named Howard Crane, gray, heavy, powerful, the kind of man who takes up physical space as a deliberate act, had said something that was factually incorrect. He had cited a development trend in Atlanta as evidence of a broader market contraction, when in fact the data she had reviewed that same week indicated precisely the opposite. She had set her wine glass down gently and said, "Actually, the Q3 figures suggest the opposite pattern. The Atlanta corridor is experiencing net positive absorption for the first time in 6 quarters. The contraction Howard is describing is specific to secondary markets in the region, not the primary corridor." The table had gone very slightly quiet. Howard Crane had looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been corrected by someone he has not yet categorized. Then Marcus, her husband, the man whose name she carried, the man she had stood beside at the altar and chosen, had laughed. A single, brief, warm laugh, pitched precisely to defuse what he had apparently decided was a social inconvenience rather than a correct observation. And then he had said, in a tone of gentle, patronizing amusement, "Ada has been doing a lot of reading lately." The table had responded to his laugh with its own smaller laugh. Relieved, grateful for the social resolution he had provided, Howard Crane had nodded and continued his original point. The conversation had moved on. Adaeze had picked up her wine glass and held it. She had not looked at Marcus. She had looked at the candle at the center of the table, a tall ivory pillar candle that was burning with a slow, steady, absolutely controlled flame. She had held herself as still as that candle for the rest of the dinner. But Eleanor had seen. Eleanor, across the table, had watched Adaeze face in the moment after Marcus's laugh, and she had smiled. A small, private smile. The smile of someone who has been conducting a long and patient operation and has just witnessed one of its intended effects land cleanly. After the guests left, while Rosa and the catering staff cleared the dining room, Adaeze had stood at the kitchen island and removed her earrings one at a time and placed them on the marble surface. Marcus had come in, loosening his tie, wearing the easy satisfaction of a successful evening. "Good night," he had said, and then, as though it were a casual administrative matter, "Oh, I've been meaning to say, I think it makes sense for you to use the guest room going forward. I've been sleeping poorly, and I think I just need the space." She had looked at him. "The guest room," she had said, "just for sleeping. It's not. It doesn't have to mean anything." She had looked at him for a long moment. His eyes had not quite held hers. His hand was still on his tie. He was a man delivering a decision, not opening a conversation. She had nodded once, slowly, picked up her earrings, and walked upstairs. In the hallway outside their bedroom, she had paused at the window and looked out at the estate grounds, the dark lawn, the pool lights reflected in the still water, the oak trees that lined the property in the autumn darkness. She had stood there for perhaps 4 minutes, not in grief, not in anger, but in the particular silence of a decision crystallizing. There are moments in a person's life when something that has been forming deep and slow for a very long time finally reaches the surface. It does not announce itself loudly. It simply arrives. Adaeze Okonkwo Blackwell recognized this moment the way she had learned to recognize everything, with clarity, with composure, and with complete understanding of what it meant. She had gone to the guest room. She had sat on the edge of the bed, and she had begun to think. She called Geneva the next morning. It was 6:15 a.m. when she picked up her personal phone, not the one Marcus, occasionally borrowed to check weather apps, but the slimmer, older device that lived in the inside pocket of her travel blazer, the one that had been in that pocket since the day her father gave it to her and said, "Always keep a line that is yours alone." She dialed from memory. The line rang twice. "Good morning, Adaeze." The voice on the other end was that of Adaeze, her father's longtime chief legal counsel and now her own, a man in his late 60s who had known her since childhood and who operated with the kind of calm competence that comes from spending a career handling matters of extraordinary consequence. "I was wondering when you would call." She stood at the bay window of the guest room, looking out at the east garden. The lawn was silver with morning frost. A robin was sitting on the stone garden wall, absolutely still. "It's time," she said. There was a brief silence on the line, not the silence of surprise. Adaeze did not surprise easily, but the silence of a man organizing his thoughts with care. "Full restructuring?" "Full restructuring. I want everything consolidated under the primary holding entity. I want the London property separated and moved into the personal trust. And I want the valuation report updated. Current figures, not the Q2 figures. I'll have the team begin today. The updated valuation will take approximately 10 days. That's fine." She ended the call. The robin on the garden wall had not moved. She went downstairs, made herself tea, and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She spent 90 minutes reviewing documents, quarterly performance summaries from 4 of her primary investment vehicles, a property development report from her Nairobi team, and a brief from her London solicitors regarding a hospitality acquisition she had been considering for several months. She made notes in the margin of each. Her handwriting was small and precise and consistent, the handwriting of someone who had been writing in the margins of important documents since she was a girl. Marcus came downstairs at 8:30, showered and dressed for a meeting. He paused briefly at the sight of her at the table with her laptop, as though he had expected to find the kitchen empty, and then recovered and opened the refrigerator. "You're up early," he said. "I usually am," she said. He said nothing further. He took his coffee to go and left the house at 8:55. Adaeze closed her laptop and sat with her tea. In the days that followed, she was present in the house in a way she had always been present. Quietly, graciously, without drama, she attended the dinner that Eleanor organized the following weekend without complaint. She responded to Marcus's conversational overtures with warmth and met his silences with her own. She was, to all outward appearances, unchanged. Internally, she was moving with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime watching her father build things. Her father had taught her that wealth, like architecture, required foundations before it required walls. You did not build walls first. You built deep, and you built true, and you built in silence, because silence kept the structure undisturbed until it was ready to bear weight. On the 8th day, she had a conversation with her financial director, Yemi Adaeze, a woman she had hired directly, who reported only to her and had never met Marcus, regarding the liquidity position of two of her smaller investment vehicles. She shifted holdings quietly, deliberately, separating what was hers with clean, legal, unambiguous lines. Not in haste, not in anger, in the methodical way of someone who had always known exactly where a property began and ended, and was now choosing to make that geography visible. On the 11th day, the updated valuation arrived. She read it at the guest room desk, in the early morning before the house was awake. The figure at the bottom of the summary page was $42,300,000,000. $42,300,000,000. She read the number twice, not because she doubted it, but because even for her, even after all these years, there was something quietly sobering about seeing that number assembled so cleanly on a page. Her father had built something extraordinary. She had grown it further. It was real. It was entirely hers. She folded the summary into her blazer pocket. She made a phone call to her solicitor in London, a woman named Charlotte Adaeze, who had been handling the formal separation of Adaeze's personal assets from any marital entanglement for the past several months, a process Adaeze had initiated quietly 9 months ago, when she had first begun to understand the direction of things. The work was clean, the documentation was complete, and Charlotte confirmed that everything was in order. There was one more call to make. She dialed her old friend and former classmate, Tokunbo Williams, now a journalist and editor at a publication that covered business and wealth in a way that was respected rather than sensational. Tokunbo had been trying, on and off, to profile the Okonkwo holdings for 4 years. Adaeze had always declined. "Tox," she said when her friend answered. "I've changed my mind about the profile." A pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Then, "Ada? When?" 2 weeks. I want it done properly. Full scope. I'll give you everything." Another pause. Then quietly, "Is everything okay?" Adaeze looked at the morning light, falling across the guest room floor. "Everything," she said, "is exactly as it should be." She hung up and sat very still. The house was quiet around her, that particular quiet of large, expensive spaces in the early morning, before anyone has asked anything of them yet. She could hear the distant sound of the sprinkler system on the east lawn. She could smell the slight coolness of the autumn air coming to the window. She had cracked open an inch. She thought of her father. She thought of the way he had sat at his desk in Lagos, surrounded by papers and silence, and how she had understood as a child that the silence was not emptiness but fullness, that it was the silence of a man who did not need to announce himself because the work announced itself. She was his daughter. She had always been his daughter. She reached into her blazer pocket and touched the folded valuation document. Then she rose from the desk, straightened her clothes, and went downstairs to make tea. The profile was published on a Thursday morning. It ran in the print edition of Africa Wealth Review, a publication with a readership of 200,000 across 4 continents, including most of the major financial centers of the world. It ran simultaneously online. By 9 a.m., it was the most read article on the platform's website. By 10, it had been picked up by 3 international business wire services. By noon, A condensed version was running on the financial pages of two major broadsheets in London. The headline read, "The Invisible Empire, Inside the $42 billion Okonkwo Dynasty and the Woman Who Runs It." Adaeze had read the piece the evening before publication. Seated at the guest room desk, going to a final fact-check draft that Tokunbo had sent for her review. It was 4,000 words, thoroughly documented, accompanied by photographs that Tokunbo's team had selected from Adaeze's own archive, photographs that had never been published before. She was in most of them the way her father had always been, present but not performing. In one, she was standing before the Okonkwo Grand Hotel in Lagos, looking at the building with an expression of calm ownership that required no caption to explain. In another, she was seated at a boardroom table in Nairobi, surrounded by her senior team, in the posture of someone who had always occupied that seat. She had approved the piece. She had gone to sleep. She had slept soundly. Marcus saw it at 8:15 a.m., at the breakfast table, on his phone. She knew the precise moment because she was pouring her tea at the kitchen counter, when she heard the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when something irreversible has just occurred. She turned. He was sitting at the breakfast table with his phone in both hands, and his face had undergone a transformation she had never seen before. Not on him, not on anyone. The transformation of a man watching his entire understanding of his own life restructure itself in real time. The way a building looks for a single suspended second between the demolition charge detonating and the structure beginning to fall. Still standing, already falling. She carried her tea to the table and sat down. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at the screen. He scrolled. He read. She could see, from the slight movement of his eyes, that he was reading carefully, not scanning, but reading the way you read something when you are hoping that the meaning will change if you go slowly enough. It did not change. "Ada," he said finally. His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before. The quality of a large room that has had all its furniture removed. "Good morning," she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were doing something complicated, cycling through registers she recognized in sequence. Disbelief, recalculation, a flash of something that might have been embarrassment, almost immediately suppressed by something that looked like it was trying very hard to be anger, but could not quite locate its footing. "Why didn't you? How long have you?" He stopped, started again. "This is your money." "Yes," she said. $42 billion. 42.3. He set his phone on the table. He looked at his hands. He had the air of a man who has just arrived at a destination he has been traveling toward for a long time without knowing it. The destination was the full, comprehensive, undeniable realization that he had been profoundly, systematically wrong. Not about one thing, but about everything. "You never said anything," he said. "You never asked," she replied. Her voice was even. Not cold. She was not cold. She was warm the way still water is warm. The warmth is real, but it will not be stirred by your hand. She looked at him steadily, with the full attention of someone who has waited a very long time for this conversation, and is now prepared to have it at whatever pace is required. "I want you to understand something," she said. She placed her teacup down gently. "I am not angry with you, Marcus. I want you to hear that clearly. I am not sitting here to punish you or to humiliate you. I am sitting here because it is my kitchen table in my house on a Thursday morning, and I am having my tea." He looked at her. "Your house," he said. "My house," she said simply. "The estate was purchased through a holding entity that my father established in 2004. It has always been part of the Okonkwo Trust portfolio. I am sure your lawyers will find the title documentation thoroughly clear on this point." The color that left his face did so thoroughly and completely. This was the moment she had not rushed. She had held it, carried it, waited for it the way her father had waited for the right moment to move, with patience, with clarity, with the absolute understanding that power exercised at the right moment costs nothing, and power exercised too early costs everything. She took a sip of her tea. "When you laughed at me at the dinner table last Saturday," she said quietly, "in front of 40 people, I sat with my wine and I looked at the candle. I don't know if you noticed. You probably did not. But I want you to know that in that moment, I was not humiliated. I was simply confirming something I already knew." He said nothing. His jaw was set, but it was the jaw of a man holding himself still because he did not know what to do with his body, not because he had something to say. "I have been your wife," she continued, with genuine intention. "I have contributed to this marriage, to your firm, to your decisions, to this home, with no need for acknowledgement, because I have never needed acknowledgement from external sources to understand my own value. That has never been a weakness of mine." She paused. She let the silence hold. "You moved me into the guest room," she said. "That was the last decision you will make in this house." At that precise moment, her phone, the slim older device, buzzed softly on the table. She glanced at it. A message from Namdi. 2 words, press received. She turned the phone face down and finished her tea. The house phone rang then. It was the landline which never rang. She did not answer it. From somewhere upstairs she heard the faint sound of Marcus's personal phone beginning to light up with calls. One after another, the sound of a world that has just received information and is trying to process it faster than it can. She rose from the table, carried her cup to the sink, rinsed it with a clean, unhurried movement of a woman in her own kitchen, and dried her hands on the linen towel hanging from the oven door. "My solicitor will be in touch," she said without turning around. "Charlotte Adaeze. She is very good." She walked out of the kitchen. In the hallway, beneath the $60,000 French chandelier, she paused for exactly 1 moment. She looked up at the chandelier. It caught the morning light exactly as it had 4 years ago, when she had stood in this spot for the first time, and thought it was beautiful. She still thought it was beautiful. She walked upstairs to begin packing. Properly, this time, not a broken-wheeled overnight bag, but the full, unhurried packing of a woman who is not leaving in shame, but in sovereignty, taking with her everything that is hers, and leaving behind nothing she will need. By Friday morning, the calls had not stopped. Marcus's partners at the firm had seen the article. His investors had seen it. His colleague from London to Atlanta had seen it. The conversations that followed were, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable. The particular discomfort of people who had sat at dinner tables and treated a woman as invisible and were now holding their phones staring at a photograph of that same woman described, in the lead paragraph of a widely read financial publication, as one of the most quietly significant wealth figures of her generation. Derek, the young partner who had interrupted her mid-sentence at the dining table, had reportedly sat in silence for a full 5 minutes after reading the article, which for him was the equivalent of a long, dark night of the soul. Howard Crane had called Marcus directly. The conversation, by Marcus's own later account to his attorney, had lasted 11 minutes and covered territory that Marcus did not enjoy revisiting. Eleanor had seen the article via a forwarded link from a member of her social circle in Connecticut, a woman named Patricia, who had attended several of the Blackwell dinners and had on at least 2 occasions spoken over Adaeze to address Marcus. Patricia had forwarded the article with a single message: "You might want to call your son." Eleanor had called. Marcus had not answered. She had driven to the estate instead, arriving at 11 a.m. on Friday, letting herself in with the key Marcus had given her years ago. She had found the house quiet. Marcus in his study, behind a closed door, Rose in the kitchen, saying nothing. Adaeze was gone. Her things had been removed from the master bedroom and the guest room both. The photographs on the windowsill, the books in the reading chair, the small frame printer Mother had given her that had hung beside the east garden window. She had taken everything that was hers with the thoroughness of someone who had been mentally cataloging their belongings for some time. She had left no note. She had not needed to. Eleanor had stood in the guest room doorway for a long time, looking at the empty space. Rosa had told Adaeze later, in a phone call, that Eleanor had looked smaller in that doorway than she had ever looked before, that the absence of someone to diminish had reduced her somehow, as though her full height had always depended on having something to stand over. The legal process that followed was handled by Charlotte Adaeze with the quiet efficiency of someone who prepared for precisely this moment. The estate's title documentation was, as Adaeze had indicated, thoroughly clear. The property had always sat within the Alconquo Trust structure. Marcus's tenancy in it had been, legally speaking, a courtesy extended by a wife to a husband, a courtesy that was now withdrawn. His attorneys reviewed the documents for 3 days and came back with nothing useful. There were meetings, of course. There were conversations through lawyers. There were moments when Marcus attempted, through intermediaries, to reframe the situation in terms more favorable to his position. Each attempt arrived at the same clean wall. The documentation was comprehensive. The structure was sound, and Adaeze's legal team was composed of people who had been building and defending structures of this kind for decades. Marcus moved into his Manhattan apartment, a property he owned outright, and which was entirely his. It was a good apartment. It was 3 bedrooms and a terrace with a view of the park, and it was worth approximately $4 million. It was, by any reasonable standard, more than most people would ever have. It was not the Connecticut estate. It was not the home he had walked through for 4 years believing to be his. It was not the world he had thought he lived in, and that, more than the money, more than the social exposure, was the thing that occupied him in those first weeks. The vertiginous, deeply disorienting experience of realizing that the architecture of your life has been built on foundations you never examined. The firm survived. Marcus was a capable enough operator that the revelation of his wife's wealth did not destroy his professional standing, though it rearranged it permanently. Because it is difficult, once people know that the quiet woman at the dinner table was worth $42 billion, and you laughed at her in front of 40 guests, to fully reassemble the version of yourself that did that. Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some reputations, once quietly revised, do not fully recover. Eleanor made no public statements. She did not call Adaeze. There was nothing to call about. The conversation had already been had, not in words, but in the clean, legal, irrefutable language of documentation and consequence. Tokunbo's article continued to circulate for weeks. It was picked up by 5 more international outlets. It generated, among the communities that care about such things, women who have been overlooked, underestimated, managed, and minimized, a quiet and sustained response that Tokunbo described as the most significant engagement she had seen in 20 years of publishing. Women wrote to the publication. They wrote about recognizing something, about sitting at dinner tables and being laughed at, about being managed and minimized and accommodated rather than seen. They wrote not about Adaeze's billions. The billions were beside the point for most of them, but about the stillness, about the patience, about the way she had waited, with full knowledge of who she was, until the moment was right. That was the thing that moved people. Not the money, the stillness. 3 months after leaving the Connecticut estate, Adaeze flew to Lagos. She had been there twice since her father's passing. Brief visits, practical in nature, concerned with business rather than return. This time she stayed for 2 weeks. She stayed in the family home in Ikoyi, the house she had grown up in, the house her father had built, the house that had always remained exactly as it was, because some things are not meant to be updated or improved, but simply preserved in their original truth. She slept in her childhood bedroom for the first time in 11 years. She woke each morning to the sound of Lagos, that enormous, layered, relentless sound of city that does not sleep so much as shift registers, moving from the night sounds to the morning sounds with the seamless confidence of something that has been doing this for centuries. She sat on the veranda each morning with her tea and watched the bougainvillea on the garden wall. She walked the property. She moved slowly. She called her mother's sister in Enugu. She had long conversations, the slow, rich, winding conversations that only exist in certain languages, conversations that carry whole lifetimes in their grammar. She cooked in the family kitchen for the first time in years, making the dishes her mother had taught her, moving to the familiar spaces of that kitchen with a wordless ease that she had not felt in a very long time. She visited her father's grave. She sat beside it for a while, on a simple wooden bench that had been placed there by the groundskeeper, and she was quiet. The harmattan had begun, and the air had that particular dry clarity of the season, a sharpness that made everything visible, made the distances seem compressed, made the world look like a place where nothing could hide. She thought about what her father had given her, not the money, though the money was real and she did not pretend otherwise, but the deeper thing, the thing beneath the money, the thing that made the money possible and that would have existed even without it, the belief, the conviction, the absolute and unshakable understanding that you do not derive your value from the rooms that receive you. You carry your value into the rooms. You have always carried it. It arrived with you, before you spoke, before you proved, before you demonstrated. It is not something you earn by convincing others. It is something you protect by refusing to surrender it, especially in the moments when someone else is trying hardest to take it from you. Her father had known this. He had lived it so quietly that most people had never seen it. She had seen it every day of her childhood, in his stillness, in his patience, in the way he built things slowly and without announcement. And then one day the building was simply there, standing in the light, requiring no explanation. She understood now, sitting beside his grave in the harmattan clarity, that the life she had lived in Connecticut, the 4 years of careful, composed, unacknowledged presence, had not been wasted. It had been preparation, not for revenge, which was too small a word for what had actually occurred, for something larger and quieter than that, for the moment when the life she had been building beneath the surface was ready to be lived above it. She was 38 years old. She had her health, her work, her people, and the clearest possible sense of what she was. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph belongs to contests, and she had not been in a contest. She had simply been herself at full volume in a room that had not known how to listen. Now the room knew. She stood from the bench and straightened her clothes and looked at her father's headstone one more time. The inscription was in both Igbo and English, as he had specified. She read the English line, the one he had written himself in the last month of his life, the line she had read 100 times, but that always arrived with the force of something new. He built quietly. He built truly. He built to last. She touched the stone once, lightly, with the flat of her hand. Then she turned and walked back to the garden toward the house, into the warm, familiar smell of the family kitchen, into the sound of Legos in the morning, into the full and unhurried and entirely sovereign life that had been hers all along. Some women spend years waiting to be recognized. Adaeze Okonkwo had spent years simply being herself, completely, patiently, and without apology. The world had finally caught up. She was in no rush. She never had been.